He expected a black-edged letter announcing the quiet, convenient death of the unwanted wife he had banished to a crumbling ruin. He did not expect to return, a year later, a broken man seeking a grave of his own, only to find the ruin resurrected and the woman he had sent to die not merely surviving, but magnificent in her defiance, the undisputed queen of a kingdom she had carved from his neglect. He had purchased a ghost to haunt his family's forgotten tomb. Instead, he found he was the specter, and she was the fierce, living heart of a home he never knew he wanted. The drawing room of the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood was a cage of gilded silk and suffocating potpourri. It was a room designed to display wealth and impeccable taste, but to Alastair, the current and thoroughly exhausted Duke of Blackwood, it felt like a mausoleum decorated for a party. Every surface gleamed with a merciless polish. Every brocaded chair was positioned with geometric precision. It was his mother's world, a universe of subtle gestures, unspoken rules, and transactions veiled as social graces. He detested it with a weariness so profound it had become a permanent ache behind his eyes. He had spent the last 6 months in the trenches of Parliament, fighting a vicious battle over grain tariffs that felt more like civilized warfare than debate, and he had returned to London not for rest, but for this, another duty, another chain. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, sat opposite him, her spine as unbending as the whalebone in her corset. Her face, a mask of powdered propriety, was fixed on the young woman seated beside her, Lady Annalise. This was the reason for the summons. Lady Annalise was his mother's choice, the culmination of a season's strategic planning. She was perfect, impeccably bred, suitably wealthy, and possessed of a gentle, bovine beauty that promised a placid and uncomplicated union. She spoke of watercolors and poetry, her voice a soft, melodic murmur that grated on Alastair's raw nerves. She was a porcelain doll, and he felt an overwhelming urge to see if she would shatter. Annalise was just saying how much she admires the North Wing Gallery at Blackwood. Alastair, the Dowager Duchess prompted, her voice crisp. She has a most artistic eye. Alastair's gaze remained fixed on the space between them, a dead zone in the Aubusson carpet. The North Wing Gallery at Blackwood Manor. He pictured it in his mind. The roof caved in, the portraits of his ancestors staring out with mildewed eyes, the floorboards softened to mulch by decades of relentless rain. He had not set foot in the ancestral seat for 15 years, not since his father's body had been carried out of it, and he had no intention of ever doing so again. The estate was a rotting tooth in the jaw of his dukedom, a place of dampness and decay he was content to let crumble into the sea. Indeed, he said, the single word costing him more effort than a 2-hour speech in the House of Lords. His mother's lips thinned into a bloodless line. His monosyllabic disinterest was a familiar and infuriating weapon in their long, cold war. She was determined to see him married, to secure the succession. He was determined to resist being shackled to a life he did not want, represented perfectly by the simpering doll beside her. He needed an heir. That much was a grim, biological fact, a duty to the title. But the thought of wedding a woman like Annalise, of spending his nights beside that placid emptiness, felt like a different kind of death. It was then that he noticed the other woman in the room. She had been there the entire time, a shadow hovering near the tea service. The paid companion. He had registered her presence as one might register a piece of furniture, a necessary but unremarkable fixture. Now, he truly saw her. She was pale and slender, dressed in a gown of such a modest, dove-gray color it seemed designed to make her disappear. But she was not disappearing. She was watching, her hands resting on the silver teapot, her stillness a stark contrast to the nervous flutter of Lady Annalise's fan. As his mother launched into another tedious monologue about the importance of the Blackwood line, the companion began to pour the tea. Her movements were economical and precise. There was no tremor in her hands, no deference in her posture. When Lady Annalise, in a moment of theatrical distress over a comment Alastair had failed to make, knocked a small porcelain dish of lemon slices, The companion caught it. Her hand darted out, a swift, sure movement that saved the dish from shattering on the floor. She righted it without a word, her expression unreadable, and continued her task as if nothing had happened. The small act of competence, of quiet control in a room suffocating with artifice, was like a stone dropped into a stagnant pool. Alistair found his gaze drawn to her. He watched her hand, steady and capable, as she passed a cup to his mother. He looked at her face. It was not beautiful in the way Lady Annalise's was. It was too thin, her cheekbones too sharp, her mouth a straight, unsmiling line. But her eyes were extraordinary. A clear, lucid gray, like a winter sky, and they held a flicker of something he recognized, a deep, guarded intelligence, a cynicism that bordered on contempt. She was not a part of this world. She was an observer, a prisoner within it, and she knew its every absurdity. An idea, cold and ruthless and utterly mad, began to form in the hollowed-out space where his emotions used to be. It was a solution, a brutal, elegant solution to all his problems. It would satisfy the letter of his duty, enrage his mother, and free him from the cloying trap of a society marriage. It was an act of pure, calculated destruction. And so you see, Alistair, the union is not merely advantageous. It is essential, his mother was concluding, her voice triumphant. Lady Annalise has graciously consented. We need only your agreement to proceed. Lady Annalise blushed and lowered her gaze, a perfect portrait of maidenly acquiescence. Alistair let the silence stretch, savoring the tightening of his mother's jaw, the nervous shifting of Annalise in her seat. His eyes, however, were on the companion. She had finished her duties and stood by the wall, her hands clasped before her, her expression perfectly neutral. But he saw the tension in her shoulders, the rigid set of her spine. She was not neutral. She was a spring coiled tight. He rose to his feet. The movement was sudden, commanding. All eyes flew to him. "No," he said. The word fell into the delicate room like a chunk of granite. His mother's face went from powdered pink to mottled red. "Alistair, what is the meaning of this? We have an agreement." Lady Annalise let out a small, wounded gasp. "The agreement is null," Alistair stated, his voice flat. He felt a strange, liberating coldness spread through him. "I will not be marrying Lady Annalise." He paused, letting the shock ripple through the room. Then he lifted a hand and pointed, a gesture of shocking crudeness, directly at the gray shadow by the wall. "I will marry her." For a moment, there was absolute silence. The companion, Elara Vance, did not flinch. She did not gasp or look away. Her lucid gray eyes met his across the room, and in them he saw not fear or confusion, but a flash of wild, startled fury. It was the look of a trapped animal that has just been offered a different, more interesting cage. The Dowager Duchess was the first to find her voice. It was a strangled hiss. "Are you insane? That is Elara Vance. She is a paid companion. Her father was a bankrupt merchant. She is nobody. She is about to be the Duchess of Blackwood," Alistair replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. He did not take his eyes off Elara. He was speaking to her now, laying out the terms of a contract, not a proposal. "Her family's debts, I believe, are considerable. They will be paid. In full. She will want for nothing. In exchange, she will give me her name, and then she will disappear." Elara's chin lifted. A flicker of color, hot and defiant, rose in her pale cheeks. "Disappear?" Her voice was low, but it carried across the room with perfect clarity, cutting through his mother's sputtering outrage. It was the first time she had spoken. It was not the voice of a servant. "To Blackwood Manor," he clarified, the name of the estate a sentence in itself. "You will be its duchess. You may do with it as you will. You will have its revenues, such as they are. You will have your title. You will not, however, have me. I will not see you. I will not write to you, and I do not wish to hear from you. You will live there, and I will live my life. In exchange for this, you will provide the Blackwood line with an heir, should I ever require one. Until then, you will be left entirely to your own devices." It was the cruelest offer he could make. He was not offering her a life. He was offering her a gilded prison, a slow, isolated death. He was buying her a piece of resilient, defiant humanity and locking her away in the one place that mirrored the ruin in his own soul. He expected her to refuse, to spit in his face. He almost hoped she would. But Alara Vance was a pragmatist. He had seen it in her steady hands, in her clear, assessing eyes. She looked from his unyielding face to the apoplectic Dowager Duchess, then to the weeping Lady Annalise, who was being comforted with useless pats on the arm. She saw the cage she was in and the new one being offered. One was a slow, humiliating erosion of self. The other was an exile, but an exile with a title, with resources, with a kind of brutal freedom. She took a slow breath. "I accept your terms, Your Grace." The words were quiet, but they sealed the transaction. His mother finally collapsed back in her chair, speechless with rage. Lady Annalise's sobs became hysterical. Alistair felt nothing but the grim satisfaction of a battle won, and the faintest, most unsettling flicker of something else as he looked at the woman who was now, for all intents and purposes, his property. It was not admiration. It was not respect. It was a cold, clinical recognition. He had chosen a survivor. He wondered, briefly, if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a study in silence. They traveled in the Duke's funereal black carriage, the leather smelling of cold polish and disuse. For 2 days, they sat opposite one another, two strangers bound by the most hostile of contracts. Alistair did not speak, his gaze fixed on the gray, weeping landscape that blurred past the window. He was a man of stone, his face a mask of indifference. He had done his duty in his own perverse way. He had acquired a duchess. Now he was delivering her to her place of exile, and then he would be free. Alara, for her part, met his silence with her own. She did not attempt conversation. She did not weep or complain. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in the lap of her plain traveling dress, and watched the world dissolve into rain and mist. She was no longer Alara Vance, penniless companion. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt like a costume, ill-fitting and absurd. She had traded one form of servitude for another. But this new cage had bars that were farther apart. She had been bought, but the price had been her family's salvation. Her father's gambling debts, which had hung over them like a shroud, were gone. Her younger sister could now have a season, a chance at a respectable marriage. Alara had sacrificed herself on the altar of their security. The knowledge was a cold, hard stone in her belly, offering no comfort, only a grim sense of finality. On the 3rd day, the air changed. It grew heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. The road, once merely poor, disintegrated into a muddy track carved between stunted, wind-tormented trees. The drumming of the rain on the carriage roof was incessant, a miserable percussion accompanying their descent into limbo. Alistair stirred for the first time in hours, his gaze sharpening as he looked out the window. "We are here," he announced, his voice rusty from disuse. Alara followed his gaze. Through the rivulets of water streaming down the glass, she saw it. Blackwood Manor did not rise from the landscape so much as rot out of it. It was a skeletal ruin crouched on a headland, a jagged silhouette of broken towers and gaping windows against a bruised purple sky. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, smothered the stone, its dark leaves glistening with rain. It was not a house. It was a tombstone. A wave of cold dread washed over her, colder than the damp air seeping through the carriage walls. This was not a home. This was a place where things came to die. The carriage lurched to a halt before a pair of wrought iron gates that hung crookedly from a single, rust-eaten hinge. A figure emerged from a small, dilapidated gatehouse, an old man hunched under a sodden wool blanket. He stared at the ducal crest on the carriage door as if he were seeing a ghost. After a long moment, he and the driver managed to heave the groaning gate open just wide enough for the carriage to pass. They proceeded up a drive, so overgrown it was barely discernible, the wheels crushing bracken and sucking at the mud. The house loomed larger, more terrible. Alara could see now that entire sections of the roof were gone, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. The salt-scoured stone was stained black with damp, and the air was thick with the smell of decay, of wet soil and mildew, and the profound, sorrowful quiet of abandonment. The carriage stopped in a courtyard that was more puddle than paving stone. The front door, a huge slab of oak, was shut fast. No lights shone in any of the windows. No welcome awaited them. Alistair opened the carriage door himself, stepping out into the driving rain without a flicker of hesitation. He did not offer Alara a hand. He simply stood there, an imposing black-clad figure against the gray ruin, and waited for her to follow. Gathering her skirts, Alara descended, her thin shoes sinking immediately into the cold mud. The rain plastered her hair to her scalp and soaked through her cloak in an instant. She stood beside him, shivering, and stared up at the monstrous facade of her new home. As if summoned, the great oak door creaked open. A woman stood framed in the darkness, holding a single, flickering candle. She was tall and severe, dressed in rusty black, her face a roadmap of disapproval. Her eyes, small and hard, swept over Alara with unconcealed contempt before settling on the Duke. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. "You were not expected." "Mrs. Croft," Alistair acknowledged, his tone clipped. "This is the Duchess. She will be residing here." Mrs. Croft's gaze flickered back to Alara, a cold, assessing look that took in her drenched clothes, her slender frame, her pale face. It was the look of an undertaker measuring a client for a coffin. There was no welcome in it, only a grim, professional interest. "The north wing is uninhabitable," Mrs. Croft stated flatly. "The east wing has the dry rot. I have kept 2 rooms in the west wing aired, as per the late dowager's instructions, for a guest who might lose their way." The implication was clear: a guest, not a mistress. "That will suffice," Alistair said. He turned to Alara then, his face impassive in the gloom. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat, tracing lines down his granite cheeks. This was it, the moment of abandonment. "The estate is yours," he said, the words a near-perfect echo of his pronouncement in his mother's drawing room. "Do with it what you will." He looked from her to the crumbling house and back again. A flicker of something, not pity, but a kind of morbid curiosity, crossed his features. "I was told your health is delicate. This climate is not kind." It was the closest he had come to acknowledging her as a person, and it was still a death sentence. "I will manage, Your Grace," Alara replied, her voice tight with cold and a burgeoning, desperate anger. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would not plead. She would not weep. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if she had just confirmed a minor business detail. "A solicitor will be in touch regarding the accounts. A quarterly draft will be deposited for your expenses." He turned away from her then, his attention already elsewhere. He was dismissing her, not just from his presence, but from his life. He strode back to the carriage without a backward glance. The door slammed shut, a sound of profound finality. The driver cracked his whip, and the carriage wheels churned in the mud, turning the vehicle around in a slow, sucking arc. Alara stood frozen in the rain, watching it go. She watched until the black carriage disappeared through the crooked gates, until the sound of its wheels was swallowed by the wind and the rain. She was alone, utterly, completely alone, left in the mud before a rotting house with a hostile housekeeper and the echo of her husband's parting words, which were not a farewell, but a prophecy. He did not look back. The room they gave her was a cage of cold. It was in the west wing, as promised, a vast, cavernous chamber with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadows. A threadbare tapestry depicting a grim hunting scene covered one wall, its colors faded to shades of gray and brown. The air was thick with the smell of cold ash from the cavernous fireplace and a deeper, more insidious scent of damp that seemed to emanate from the very stones. The massive, canopied bed was an island in the gloom, its hangings heavy with the dust of ages. When Alara touched the sheets, they felt clammy, as if they had been laundered in sea mist. Mrs. Croft had left her with a single candle and a pitcher of lukewarm water. "Dinner is at 7, she had announced, before departing and shutting the door with a thud that echoed in the oppressive silence. It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the clear expectation that Alara would be too overwhelmed, too sickly, to appear. For the first week, they were right. The chill of the house seeped into her bones, a malevolent presence that sought out the inherent weakness in her lungs. A cough that had been a mild annoyance in London became a deep, racking affliction. She spent most of her days in a monstrous bed, huddled under a mountain of musty blankets, listening to the eternal symphony of the house, the whistle of wind through cracked window panes, the drip of water in some unseen corridor, the scuttling of unseen things behind the walls. Her meals appeared on a tray, brought by a young, terrified maid named Mary who would not meet her eyes. The food was bland and sparse, thin gruel, stale bread, weak tea. It was survival rations, designed not to nourish but to merely sustain, and poorly at that. Alara knew, with a certainty that went beyond paranoia, that this was Mrs. Croft's doing. The housekeeper was managing the Duchess's decline. She was fulfilling the Duke's unspoken command, to let her die quietly. Despair was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that smothered her. She would lie in the semi-darkness, the damp air rasping in her throat, and think of her husband, the Duke, the man who had bought her and discarded her like a faulty piece of machinery. She pictured his cold, impassive face, and a hot, useless anger would burn through the fog of her illness. He expected her to fade away, to become another ghost in this haunted place. Her death would be a tidy end to an inconvenient transaction. A black-edged letter would arrive in London. He would feel a flicker of grim satisfaction, and then he would forget her name. One afternoon, during a lull in the rain, a weak sliver of sunlight pierced the grime on the window. It fell across the floor, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes. Alara watched them dance, mesmerized. They were so busy, so alive, in their tiny, insignificant way. And she was lying here, in this clammy bed, drowning in dust and damp and self-pity. She was waiting to die. She coughed, a deep, rattling spasm that shook her whole frame and left her breathless. When it subsided, she lay panting, her head swimming. She could feel the fever, a low, constant burn behind her skin. She could feel the fluid gathering in her lungs. This was how it would end, not with a bang, but with a whimper in a cold, forgotten room on the edge of the world. And something inside her snapped. It was a feeling of pure, white-hot rage. It was a rebellion against the narrative that had been written for her. She was not a porcelain doll like Annalise, to be shattered by a harsh word. She was not a tragic, wilting heroine from a novel. She was Alara Vance, daughter of a man who had gambled away a fortune but had taught her how to read a ledger. She was a survivor who had navigated the treacherous waters of society as a paid companion, a life that required the cunning of a fox and the hide of a rhinoceros. She had been bought, yes. She had been banished, but she was not dead yet. With a groan of effort that felt monumental, she threw back the covers. The cold air hit her like a slap, but it was bracing. It was real. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the icy floorboards. Shivering, she stood up. The room tilted violently, and she had to grab the bedpost to steady herself, black spots dancing in her vision. She took a breath, then another. She was a living woman, not a dying one, and she would start acting like it. She looked around the vast, tomb-like room. This was the first enemy. This room, with its dampness and its shadows, was actively trying to kill her. It was a weapon being used against her by Mrs. Croft, by the house, by the Duke himself. A new thought, practical and defiant, cut through the fever haze. Where was the warmest place in this godforsaken house? Where was the fire that never died? The kitchens. Wrapping a thin wool shawl around her shoulders, she shuffled to the door. She pulled the heavy bell rope, the sound jangling discordantly in the hall. She waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of weakness and adrenaline. After a long moment, she heard footsteps. The door opened to reveal the startled face of Mary, the young maid. Your Grace? The girl stammered, her eyes wide. Are you well? No, Mary, I am not well, Elara said, her voice a hoarse rasp, but firm. But I intend to be. She took a steadying breath and issued her first command as Duchess of Blackwood. You will find Mr. Hemlock, the groundsman. You will have him and one other man come to this room. They're to move my bed, my trunk, and that small writing desk to the main kitchen. Immediately, Mary stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. To the kitchen, Your Grace. The kitchen, Elara repeated, her voice gaining strength. It is warm there, is it not? Well, yes, but Mrs. Croft. Mrs. Croft works for me now, does she not? Elara fixed the girl with a look of unwavering intensity. I am a duchess. This is my house. I will not die of a chill in a state bedroom while there is a perfectly good fire in the servants' quarters. Now go. The girl, stunned into obedience by this sudden, shocking display of authority from the woman they had all written off as a ghost in waiting, turned and fled. Elara stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support, a faint, grim smile touching her lips for the first time since she had arrived. The turning point had come. She had stopped being a victim. The reclamation of Blackwood Manor had begun. The move to the kitchen was an act of revolution. When two bewildered-looking men, one of them a gnarled, weather-beaten man she presumed was Hemlock, arrived to dismantle her bed, Mrs. Croft appeared in their wake like a storm cloud. Your Grace, she began, her voice vibrating with outrage. This is highly improper. The kitchens are for the staff. Elara, who had seated herself in the room's only chair, wrapped in blankets, met the housekeeper's furious gaze without flinching. This house is improper, Mrs. Croft. It is a death trap. I am moving to the only room that is not actively trying to kill me. If you have an objection, you may take it up with the Duke. I believe his direction was for me to do as I will. She coughed, a dry, painful bark, but did not look away. I will to be warm. The housekeeper was stymied. To defy the order was to defy the Duke's own decree. She stood, rigid with fury, as the men carried out the pieces of the bed. Elara had won the first skirmish. Life in the kitchen was a revelation. A vast, cavernous space with a flagstone floor. It was dominated by a huge cooking hearth where a fire was kept perpetually banked. It was warm. The air smelled of wood smoke and baking bread and drying herbs, not of mildew and decay. Elara had her bed set up in a far corner, near a small window that looked out not on the bleak sea, but onto a sheltered, overgrown courtyard. She had found the beating heart of the house, and she had claimed it. For the first few days, she did little but rest, absorbing the warmth, breathing the clean, smoky air. The kitchen staff, the cook, a plump, wary woman named Mrs. Gable, and the terrified Mary, moved around her with cautious awkwardness. But her presence, so shocking at first, began to normalize. They saw a woman who, despite her title, was not afraid of the practical center of a household. They heard her cough lessen. They saw the feverish glitter in her eyes recede. Once her strength began to return, Elara's mind, sharp and pragmatic, took over. She asked for the estate ledgers. Mrs. Croft produced them with ill-concealed reluctance, a set of massive, dust-covered tomes. Elara spent her days at the small writing desk she'd had moved, propped up with pillows, a shawl around her shoulders, and she began to read. What she found was a story of catastrophic neglect. The accounts stretched back decades, detailing an estate that had once been prosperous, with revenue from tenant farms, fishing fleets, and timber. But for the last 20 years, the income had dwindled to a trickle, while the expenses for a skeleton staff maintaining a decaying house remained. The Duke, her husband, clearly never looked at these books. He simply allowed a stipend to be paid, a pittance to keep the ruin from collapsing entirely. The quarterly draft he had promised her was generous by her old standards, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the needs of the estate. She saw waste everywhere. A staff of 12 indoor servants for a house with only one occupant. A wine cellar full of priceless vintages, untouched. Storerooms filled with silver and furniture from the abandoned wings, slowly being consumed by damp and rot. Her first official act as manager of the estate was to summon Mrs. Croft. The housekeeper stood before her desk, her arms crossed, radiating disapproval. "Mrs. Croft," Elara began, her voice clear and steady. "As of this Friday, the employment of 8 members of the indoor staff will be terminated. They will be given a month's wages and a reference, if they desire one. You, Mrs. Gable, Mary, and Mr. Hemlock will remain." The housekeeper's jaw dropped. "You cannot. These people have served the family for years. They have served a ghost of a family in a ghost of a house," Elara countered calmly, tapping a page in the ledger. "There is no money to pay them. Their wages are a drain on an empty coffer. We are keeping only those essential to our survival here." "Our survival?" Mrs. Croft sneered. "Yes, our survival," Elara affirmed. "You may, of course, choose to be one of the 8 who leave." It was a gamble, but Elara had seen the pride in the woman, the deep, if twisted, loyalty to the house itself. Mrs. Croft stared at her, a battle raging in her cold eyes. Then, with a curt, angry nod, she turned and left to deliver the news. The fortress of Blackwood was being consolidated. Next, she summoned Mr. Hemlock. The groundsman was a man of few words, his face tanned to leather by wind and sun. He stood before her, twisting his cap at his gnarled hands, his gaze respectful but wary. "Mr. Hemlock," she said, pointing to a diagram she had sketched. "This courtyard outside the kitchen. It is sheltered from the wind. Is the soil any good?" He considered the question. "Aye, Duchess. Was the old garden back in the day. Good drainage. Gets the morning sun." "Excellent," Elara said. "Tomorrow, you and I will begin to turn it over. We are going to plant a kitchen garden. A large 1-inch. Hemlock's eyebrows shot up. "You, Duchess." "I have 2 hands, Mr. Hemlock. I intend to use them. We will need seeds, and tools, and manure." She pushed a small, heavy purse across the desk. It was filled with coins from her own meager savings, what little she had brought with her. "Take the cart into the village. Buy what we need." The look on the groundsman's face was one of dawning, incredulous respect. He took the purse with a nod. "Aye, Duchess. That I will." The work was brutal. Her body, soft from a life lived indoors, screamed in protest. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and pouring tea, were soon blistered and raw. But as she knelt in the rich, dark soil beside Hemlock, turning over the earth, clearing the weeds, she felt a profound and deeply satisfying connection to the world. She was not a duchess. She was not a patient. She was a woman planting a garden, an act of defiant hope against the encroaching decay. Her next moves were even more audacious. She had Hemlock and the 2 remaining able-bodied men from the village board up the entrances to the north and east wings, sealing them off like tombs. It was a practical decision. It cut down on drafts and prevented the rot from spreading, but it was also symbolic. She was abandoning the dead parts of the house to focus on the living core. Then she tackled the finances. With Hemlock's help, she cataloged the contents of the abandoned rooms. Silver candelabra, tarnished and heavy. A set of Louis Quinn's chairs, their silk upholstery shredded but their frames intact. A collection of Chinese vases. She was ruthless. She had Hemlock load the most valuable, transportable items onto a wagon and sent him to the nearest large town, with a letter for a reputable auctioneer. The proceeds were astonishing. It was a small fortune, enough to buy a milking cow, a flock of chickens, 2 pigs, and enough seed to plant a small field of oats and potatoes. It was enough to pay for timber and skilled labor to properly repair the roof over the kitchen, the stables, and the small wing of rooms directly above them. Mrs. Gable, the cook, who had watched these proceedings with a wary eye, began to thaw. When the first fresh egg arrived from their new chickens, she made a light, fluffy omelet, rich with butter from their new cow, and served it to Elara with a small, hesitant smile. When the first tender lettuces came up in the garden, she made a salad. The food was no longer gruel. It was a celebration of their slow, hard-won progress. The house was beginning to provide. Even Mrs. Croft, her old adversary, began a slow, grudging transformation. She saw a house that was now clean, not because of a large staff, but because it was smaller, more manageable. She saw a larder that was beginning to fill, not with goods bought from afar, but with food they had grown themselves. Her pride in the Blackwood name, once a source of bitter resentment toward Alara, began to attach itself to this new, practical incarnation of the estate. She never became warm, but her criticism turned into grudging advice, her disapproval into a silent, watchful supervision of their shared project. Over the course of a year, Blackwood Manor was transformed. It was not restored to its former glory. It was reborn as something new. The vast, rotting shell remained, a monument to a dead past. But at its heart was a small, thriving fortress. Smoke rose consistently from the main chimney. The walled garden was a riot of productive green. The sound of a cow lowing and chickens clucking replaced the mournful cry of the wind in empty corridors. The house was no longer a tomb. It was fiercely, stubbornly alive. And Alara, her face now lightly tanned by the sun, her hands calloused, her cough a distant memory, was its undisputed queen. She had not merely survived. She had built a kingdom from ruins. Alastair, Duke of Blackwood, rode toward his ancestral home as a man seeking sanctuary in a tomb. The past year had flayed him raw. The political victory he had won had turned to ash in his mouth. The alliances he had forged had proved treacherous, and a brief, sordid affair had ended in public humiliation and blackmail. He was exhausted to his very soul. London, with its grasping ambition and suffocating society, had become intolerable. He needed silence. He needed an ending. He thought of the wife he had banished. He had not received the black-edged letter he had half expected. His solicitor had informed him, with some surprise, that the new Duchess had dismissed the London-based factor who managed the estate and had taken over the accounts herself. The quarterly drafts he sent were being deposited, but reports from the village, sparse and infrequent as they were, spoke of strange activity, of sales, of planting. He had dismissed it as the last frantic scrabbling of a dying woman. He pictured her, frail and consumptive, railing against the inevitable in a crumbling house. The image brought him no satisfaction, only a dull, empty ache. He had been cruel, and his cruelty had achieved nothing but the banishment of one more person from his life. Now he was returning to the scene of his crime, not out of guilt, but out of a profound, nihilistic desire for the peace of the grave. Blackwood Manor, he thought, was the perfect place to rot. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not as he expected, was the gate. It was no longer a crooked, rusted thing hanging from a single hinge. It was straight, solid, and painted a stark, functional black. It stood closed. As he dismounted, a young boy, no older than 10, emerged from the gatehouse, which now had a tidy, repaired roof and a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. "State your business," the boy said, his voice piping but firm. Alastair stared. "This is Blackwood Manor. I am the Duke of Blackwood." The boy looked him up and down, taking in his travel-stained clothes and weary face. "The Duchess ain't expecting no duke," he said, with the simple logic of a child. "But you can wait here. I'll send word." Before Alastair could react, the boy had darted off up the drive. Stunned, Alastair pushed the now unlocked gate open and led his horse through. The change was immediate and profound. The drive was no longer an overgrown mud track. It was clear, laid with fresh gravel that crunched under his boots. The wild, tangled woods on either side had been cut back, the timber neatly stacked. Through the trees, he could see what looked like a fenced pasture, with sheep grazing placidly. He walked his horse up the drive, a growing sense of dislocation settling over him. This was not the place he remembered. This was not the ruin he had left. The air itself felt different. It still smelled of the sea, but now it was mingled with the scent of wood smoke and livestock and turned earth. It was the smell of a working farm. As he rounded the final bend, the house came into view, and he stopped dead. The skeletal silhouette was still there, the abandoned wings still gaping and dark against the sky. But the central section, the heart of the manor, was utterly transformed. The roof was whole, a patchwork of new and old slate that gleamed in the pale afternoon light. The windows were glazed and clean. Smoke plumed from a massive chimney, a steady, confident banner of life. The courtyard, once a swamp, was now paved with clean flagstones. Tubs of hardy, salt-resistant flowers added shocking splashes of color. He felt as if he had stumbled into the wrong story. He had come here seeking a tomb, and he had found a fortress. He tethered his horse to a newly installed ring on the wall and, feeling like a trespasser, approached not the grand, sealed front door, but a smaller side door from which he could hear the faint sounds of activity. He pushed it open and stepped inside. He was in the kitchens. The warmth hit him first, a solid, living thing. It was a wave of heat from the massive hearth, where a joint of meat was turning on a spit. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and herbs and baking bread. The room was bustling. A plump woman he didn't recognize stood at a table, kneading dough. A young maid was polishing a copper pot. And in the corner, at a large scrub pine table that served as a desk, sat a woman. Her back was to him. She was leaning over a massive ledger, a pen in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her dark hair was not styled in any fashionable manner, but was ruthlessly twisted up and pinned to get out of her way. She wore a simple, practical dress of dark wool, its cuffs stained with ink. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The young maid was the first to see him. Her eyes went wide, and the pot slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly on the flagstones. The woman at the table did not startle. She finished the line of figures she was writing, carefully blotted the ink, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned. It was Alara, but it was not the pale, slender ghost he had abandoned in the rain. That woman was gone. This woman was magnificent. The sharp angles of her face had softened, filled out. There was color in her cheeks, a healthy glow that came from sun and wind and hard work. Her eyes, those lucid gray eyes he remembered, were clear and direct. But now they held not just cynicism, but an unshakable, deeply rooted authority. She was not a prisoner here. She was the ruler. She looked at him, her gaze sweeping over his exhausted, disheveled form. There was no surprise in her expression, no fear, no welcome. There was only a cool, weary assessment. Alistair found he could not speak. He had prepared himself for a grave, for recriminations, for a consumptive wraith. He had not, in any possible version of his grim future, prepared for this. For her. He finally found his voice. It came out as a hoarse croak. "You're alive." A faint, ironic smile touched Alara's lips. It did not reach her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, the queen upon her makeshift throne, and surveyed the man who was by law her husband and her master, but who looked, at that moment, like a beggar who had wandered in from the storm. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she said, her voice as cool and clear as a winter morning. "Would you care for some tea? Or have you merely come to inspect the foundations before they give way entirely?" The confrontation hung in the air, thick as the wood smoke. Alistair stood, a titan of London society, a powerful duke whose word could make or break men, and felt utterly, completely unmanned. He was an intruder in his own house. No, he corrected himself with a sudden, jarring clarity. It was not his house. It was hers. The cook and the maid stared, frozen, looking from him to Alara, their allegiance in the sudden, silent power struggle perfectly, terrifyingly clear. They were her people. He was the stranger. "I did not expect this," he finally managed, the understatement so vast it was comical. He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, at her. "Few people expect their investments to flourish in a graveyard," Alara replied, her tone sharp. She picked up her pen, as if to dismiss him. "Is there a purpose to this visit, Your Grace? The harvest is in 2 weeks, and the accounts for the fishing lease will not balance themselves." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, reminding him of his neglect, establishing her own competence. She was not his meek, sickly wife. She was the manager of a thriving enterprise, and he was an interruption. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it almost made him laugh. Almost. "This is my home," he stated, the words sounding hollow and false even to his own ears. He was trying to reclaim a footing, to reassert an authority that had evaporated the moment he stepped through the door. Alara's gaze met his. It was cold steel. "This," she said, her voice low and intense, "is the home I built. You provided the ruin. I provided the labor. You are a guest here, Your Grace. I suggest you start acting like 1 inch." She turned back to her ledger, the line of her back a declaration of war. The dismissal was absolute. Stung, Alistair took a step forward. "I'm still the Duke. This is my estate." Before Alara could respond, a new figure appeared in the doorway from the courtyard. It was the gnarled groundsman, Hemlock, his arms full of firewood. He stopped when he saw Alistair, his eyes narrowing. He did not bow. He did not acknowledge the Duke's presence at all. His gaze went straight to Alara's back. "Duchess," he said, his voice rough but respectful. "The wind's shifting. A storm's coming in from the north. A bad one, by the look of the sky. We should get the livestock into the main barn." Without turning, Alara replied, "See to it, Mr. Hemlock. Check the shutters on the west-facing windows and bring in the rest of the laundry from the line." "Aye, Duchess." Hemlock nodded and disappeared, having not once looked at the master of the house. The exchange was more devastating than any verbal assault. It laid the truth of the situation bare. Alistair's title meant nothing here. Authority in this place was not inherited, it was earned, and he had earned nothing but contempt. He stood in the warm, bustling kitchen, a ghost in his own life, watching the back of the woman he had tried to destroy, and realized with a sickening certainty that he had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had sent her to a tomb, and she had resurrected it, leaving him to be the one who was buried. The storm Hemlock had predicted arrived with the ferocity of a naval bombardment. By nightfall, the wind was a physical presence, a shrieking, solid wall of force that slammed against the manor. Rain came in horizontal sheets, rattling the window panes in their frames. And then came the sound of the sea. It was not the gentle shushing of waves on a distant shore. It was a deep, percussive roar, the sound of mountains of water hurling themselves against the cliffs below the house. Alistair had been given a room, a small, clean chamber above the kitchens. It was part of the wing Alara had reclaimed. It was warm and dry, a world away from the ducal suite he vaguely remembered, but he found no comfort in it. He stood at the window, watching the black, churning chaos of the storm, and the sound began to work on him. The relentless, concussive roar of the waves. The high-pitched scream of the wind, like incoming artillery. The shuddering of the house under each new assault. The sound's pride opened a door in his mind he had long kept nailed shut. A door that led back to the muddy fields of the continent, to a night spent huddled in a trench as French cannons walked their fire closer and closer. The smell of wet wool and fear. The screams of men. The earth-shaking whump of an exploding shell that had buried him alive for 3 hours, leaving him with nothing but darkness and the sound of his own frantic heartbeat. He backed away from the window, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. His breath grew short. The walls of the small room seemed to be closing in, the air growing thick and unbreathable. He was not in Blackwood Manor. He was back in that trench, the weight of the earth pressing down on him, the world reduced to a chaotic symphony of destruction. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trying to block out the noise. But the noise was inside him now. The roar of the sea was the roar of the cannons, and the house was a coffin of wet earth. He did not know how long he sat there, trapped in the grip of the past, his body rigid, his mind a maelstrom of terror. He was lost. Downstairs, Alara was making her rounds. The storm was the worst she had seen in her year at Blackwood, and it was a test of every repair they had made. With Hemlock and a lantern, she checked the barn, where the animals were safe and quiet. She checked the sea wall they had spent the summer reinforcing with stones from the collapsed east wing. It was holding. The fortress was secure. Returning to the kitchen, she found Mary trying to coax Mrs. Gable out from under the main table. The cook, terrified of storms, was whimpering softly. Alara sent Mary to her own small room with a candle and a book, then poured a generous measure of brandy into a mug of tea and slid it under the table for Mrs. Gable. "It's holding, Beatrice," she said calmly. "The roof is sound. We are safe." Only then, as a fragile quiet settled over the kitchen, broken only by the howl of the wind and the cook's muffled sobs, did she think of the Duke, the intruder. She had felt a grim satisfaction in his shock, in his displacement. But now, as the storm raged, a different feeling surfaced, a flicker of responsibility. He was, for all his sins, a person under her roof, and her roof was currently weathering a hurricane. With a sigh of weary resignation, she took a candle and made her way upstairs. She did not expect to offer comfort, merely to see that his window was not leaking or that he had not, in a fit of pique, set the place on fire. She knocked softly on his door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "Your Grace." Still nothing but the roar of the storm. A prickle of unease went through her. She tried the handle. It was unlocked. Pushing the door open, she held the candle high and stepped inside. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, perfectly still, his back to her. He was fully dressed, but his posture was all wrong. It was not the arrogant, straight-back posture of the Duke of Blackwood. It was the rigid, frozen posture of a man braced for an impact. "Your Grace?" she said again, her voice soft. Alistair. He did not turn. He did not seem to hear her. He was staring at the far wall, but his eyes were not seeing the room. They were wide, fixed on some inner horror. His face, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, was pale and slick with sweat. His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. Alara had seen shell-shocked men in the villages after the wars. Men who stared at nothing, who jumped at the sound of a closing door, who were lost in a battle that had ended years ago. She had never imagined that the cold, detached Duke of Blackwood could be one of them. The armor he wore was not just arrogance. It was a shell, and the storm had cracked it wide open. He was not a tyrant in that moment. He was not her tormentor. He was a broken man, drowning in a sea of his own memory. The anger and resentment she had nurtured for a year flickered and died, replaced by something she could not name. It was not pity. It was a shock of recognition. She, who had fought her own battle for survival in this house, was looking at a casualty of a different, more brutal war. She closed the door behind her, shutting them in together against the storm. She placed her candle on the small table, its light casting huge, dancing shadows. She did not touch him. She did not speak the soft, soothing words one might offer a frightened child. Her pragmatism, the very quality that had ensured her survival, dictated a different course. He was not a child. He was a man lost in a non-existent reality. He needed an anchor to the here and now. She pulled a small wooden chair from the corner and sat down opposite him, close enough that he could not ignore her, but not so close as to be a threat. "The sea wall is holding," she said, her voice even and practical. "I was worried about the section near the old boathouse, but the stones we packed in this summer have shored up. Hemlock thinks we'll lose a few slates from the barn roof, but the livestock are secure." He gave no sign of hearing her. The only sound from him was his own ragged breathing. She kept talking. She did not talk about him, or about the storm of memory he was clearly trapped in. She talked about the mundane, tangible reality of the world she had built. "The potato harvest was better than I expected. The soil in the west field is sandier than I thought. Next year, I think we'll try turnips there instead. They do better in poor soil. We'll need to rotate the crops, in any case. The chickens have finally started laying again. We had to slaughter the old rooster. He was terrorizing the hens." She spoke of crop rotations and roof repairs, of the price of wool in the local market, of a sick cow and a leaky barrel. She built a wall of words, a fortress of practicality, around him. Her voice was a low, steady drone, a counter-rhythm to the chaotic violence of the storm outside. It was an anchor thrown into his turbulent mind. For an hour, she talked, and slowly, Imperceptibly at first, a change began. The rigidity in his shoulders lessened. His breathing, while still harsh, became deeper, more regular. His gaze, once fixed on the horrors only he could see, began to flicker. He blinked once, twice. His eyes moved from the wall to the floor, and then, finally, to her. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The terror was receding from his eyes, leaving behind a vast, hollowed-out exhaustion. He looked at her, sitting in the simple chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm in the candlelight, and he saw not the Duchess, not his unwanted wife, but the woman who had sat with him in the dark while the world fell apart, talking about potatoes. He finally spoke. His voice was a raw whisper. The cannons, they stopped. Alara's own breath, which she hadn't realized she was holding, escaped in a slow sigh. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," she said softly. "The storm is passing. It's almost dawn." She did not ask him what he meant. She did not press the advantage. She simply accepted his reality and guided him gently back to hers. For the first time since he had bought her, a silence fell between them that was not a weapon, but a fragile, exhausted truce. In the heart of the storm, in the ruins of their shared past, something new and terrifyingly vulnerable had begun to take root. The dawn broke, bruised and exhausted. The wind had subsided to a mournful sigh, and the rain had softened to a fine drizzle. The sea, though still swollen and gray, had ceased its thunderous assault. A profound quiet settled over the world, the quiet of the morning after a battle. Alistair had not slept. After his whispered confession, he had simply sat, his great frame slumped, while Alara continued her low monologue. She had moved from crop rotations to the estate ledgers, explaining her system of accounting in the same calm, practical tone. He had listened, not to the words, but to the sound of her voice, the steady, grounding cadence that kept the ghosts at bay. At some point, she had risen and fetched a blanket from the bed, draping it over his shoulders. He had not protested. The simple, non-intimate act of care was so unexpected it had broken through the last of his defenses. Now, in the pale light, he looked at her. She was still in the chair, her head tilted back against the wall, her eyes closed. She had fallen asleep. There were faint, purple smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, and the ink stain was still on her cuff. She looked tired and strong, and more real than any person he had ever known. He had tried to break her, and instead, when he had broken, she had quietly, practically, put him back together. The thought was a source of profound, humbling shame. Quietly, so as not to wake her, he stood up. The blanket pooled at his feet. He felt empty. The terror was gone, but so was the anger, the arrogance, the entire edifice of the man he had been. He was hollowed out, scoured clean by the storm, both inside and out. He looked at the sleeping woman who was his wife, and felt a debt he could never repay. He left the room and went downstairs. The kitchen was quiet, Mrs. Gable having finally crawled out from under the table and retired to her bed. A low fire still glowed in the hearth. The air was cool now, smelling of damp stone and the clean scent of rain-washed air. He went outside. The courtyard was a mess of fallen leaves and debris, but the structure of it, the order Alara had imposed, was intact. He walked past the kitchen garden, noting the plants battered but not destroyed, and made his way to the stables. The smell of horses and hay was earthy and real. He found a pitchfork and, with the awkwardness of a man who had not performed manual labor in 20 years, began to muck out a stall. The repetitive, mindless work was a balm. It was real. It was tangible. It was a task with a clear beginning and a clear end. He was so engrossed in the work that he didn't hear her approach. "That is not a task for a duke, your grace." He turned. Alara stood in the stable doorway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She looked rested. Her hair was neatly pinned, and she held 2 steaming mugs. He leaned the pitchfork against the wall. "I'm not sure what I am, at the moment," he said, the admission costing him a great deal. "But I suspect I'm not much of a duke." She walked toward him and handed him one of the mugs. It was strong, hot tea. Their fingers brushed as he took it. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark of warmth in the cold emptiness. She did not press him or mock his vulnerability. She simply leaned against the wooden partition of the stall, sipping her own tea, and looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes. "The storm has passed," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. He took a sip of the tea. It was scalding hot and unsweetened. It was perfect. "Thank you." The words were for the tea, and for so much more. She gave a small nod, accepting both meanings. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment. The only sounds the soft shuffling of the horses and the drip of water from the eaves. He felt a sudden, desperate need to explain, to confess, to make her understand the man behind the monster she knew. "In the war," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his mug. "I was a captain. Young. Arrogant. I thought I knew everything about strategy. I ordered an advance on a position we were told was lightly defended. It was a trap." He paused, the memory still sharp, still painful. "We walked into a crossfire. I lost 34 men in 10 minutes. My fault. Entirely my fault. I was buried when a shell hit the trench. When they dug me out, I could not speak for a week." He had never told anyone this. Not his father, not his friends, not his confessors. He told her, the woman he had wronged more than any other. He expected condemnation, or worse, pity. Alara was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, practical. 34 men is a terrible loss," she said. "But a kitchen garden can only feed 20. Sometimes, the information you're given is wrong. All you can do is plant for a better harvest next year." He looked up at her, startled. It was the most extraordinary response he could have imagined. She had not offered absolution or sympathy. She had taken his grand, tragic confession and translated it into her own pragmatic language. She had acknowledged the loss, but framed it as a problem of logistics, of bad intelligence, of learning from a catastrophic failure. She was not judging his soul. She was assessing his strategy. She understood, in her own fiercely practical way, the burden of command, the weight of impossible choices. A laugh escaped him. It was a raw, rusty sound, but it was genuine. He had not truly laughed in years. "A better harvest," he repeated, shaking his head in wonder. "Is that how you see the world? As a field to be cultivated? It is a more useful way of seeing it than as a ballroom or a battlefield," she replied, a faint smile touching her own lips. "Things grow in a field." He looked at her, at the woman who had made a garden grow from a graveyard, and knew she was right. He had been living in a world of ghosts and battles, a world of decay. She lived in a world of growth and stubborn, practical life. He took the pitchfork again. "Show me how it's done properly," he said. "This mucking out." She raised an eyebrow. "You are serious?" "I have never been more so," he said. And so the Duke of Blackwood, the powerful, haunted man of politics and war, was given a lesson in mucking out a stable by his pragmatic, ink-stained duchess. It was not a romantic moment. It was earthy and smelled of hay and manure. But as they worked together, a new dynamic began to form. The silence between them was no longer a weapon, but a shared space of quiet labor. He learned the rhythms of the estate, the endless, satisfying cycle of tasks that kept their small fortress running. The days that followed fell into a new, unspoken routine. The truce forged in the storm solidified into a partnership. Alistair found that the skills he had learned as an engineer in the army, skills he had thought long buried, were useful here. He saw the flaw in the design of the sea wall and, with Hemlock's help, spent a week hauling rocks and mixing mortar to reinforce it properly. He designed a system of pulleys to make lifting hay to the barn loft more efficient. He was not giving orders as a duke. He was offering his expertise as a partner. Alara, in turn, began to show him her own domain. She spread the estate ledgers on the kitchen table and explained her financial strategy. He was astounded. She had not just managed the pittance he had sent her. She had created new revenue streams. The fishing lease, the sale of wool from their small flock, a contract to provide timber to a boat builder in the village. She had taken his rotting, moribund asset and made it profitable. "You are a genius," he said one evening, staring at a column of figures that showed a modest but definite profit for the quarter. She looked up from the ledger, a rare flush of pleasure on her cheeks. "I am practical, Your Grace. Neglect is expensive. I simply cut the costs." "Alistair," he corrected her, his voice quiet. "My name is Alistair." She held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Alistair," she repeated softly. They worked together. In the mornings, he would join Hemlock in the fields or with repairs, his body growing hard and lean, the London pallor replaced by a healthy, wind-burned tan. In the afternoons, he would sit with Alara in the kitchen, poring over the ducal accounts he had neglected for years. He was horrified to see the waste and mismanagement, the corruption of factors and solicitors. She, with her sharp, incisive mind, helped him cut through the tangled mess. They became a team. He was the sword, his title and ruthless political instincts now used to protect her domain from the outside world. She was the shield, the practical, grounding force that made that domain worth protecting. One afternoon, as they were reviewing a map of the tenant farms, their heads bent close together over the table, his hand brushed against hers. Neither of them pulled away. For a moment, his hand simply rested over hers on the old paper. It was not a gesture of passion, but of anchor. It was a moment of quiet connection, a recognition of their shared space, their shared work. The warmth of her skin against his was a simple, profound fact. He was here. She was here. They were together. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they had retreated. The roar of the cannons was replaced by the sound of the wind in the newly repaired eaves, the lowing of their cow, the steady, calm sound of Alara's voice as she tallied the week's egg production. He had come to Blackwood seeking a grave, a final silence. Instead, he was finding a life. The old world arrived on a lathered horse, in the form of a royal courier. He galloped into the courtyard one bright, cold autumn afternoon, a man so out of place in their rustic fortress that he might as well have been from the moon. He was dressed in the king's livery, his face pinched with the importance of his mission and the misery of his journey. Alistair and Alara were in the courtyard, inspecting a new chicken coop Alistair had designed. He was explaining the merits of his hinged roosting bars when the courier slid for his exhausted horse, stumbling on the clean flagstones. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood?" the courier gasped, spotting Alistair's tall frame. He held out a mud-spattered leather satchel. "An urgent dispatch from His Majesty the King." The words fell into the peaceful afternoon like a death knell. The King. A dispatch. London. Alistair felt a familiar coldness seep into his bones. It was the call of duty, the summons back to the world of politics and power, the world that had almost destroyed him. He looked at the sealed dispatch, with its imposing royal wax, and felt a profound weariness. But when he looked at Alara, the weariness turned into a sharp, painful pang. The transformation in her was instantaneous and devastating. The easy partnership of the past weeks vanished, as if it had never been. Her face became a cool, polite mask. Her spine straightened. The wall she had so carefully lowered went crashing back into place, higher and more impregnable than ever. She was no longer Alara, his partner. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, the formal chatelaine of his estate. She took a small step back, creating a physical distance between them. "You will be wanting to read that in private, Your Grace," she said, her voice clipped and formal, the Alistair of yesterday, a forgotten dream. "I shall have Mrs. Gable prepare provisions for your journey. The roads will be poor after the rain." She was already preparing for his departure. She assumed, without question, that he would go, that this idyll, this partnership, was a temporary aberration, that the real world, the world of dukes and kings, would inevitably reclaim him, and she would be left behind once more, the custodian of his remote folly. Her expression was perfectly neutral, but he could see the deep, wrenching hurt in the rigid set of her shoulders, in the way she refused to meet his eyes. He had abandoned her once. Of course, she believed he would do it again. The courier watched them, his expression impatient. "Your Grace," a reply is expected with all haste. Alistair looked from the courier's officious face to the sealed dispatch in his hand, the physical manifestation of his old life. He felt its weight, the burden of 1,000 duties he no longer wanted. He thought of the House of Lords, of the endless, meaningless battles, of the treachery and the exhaustion. He thought of the man he had been, a hollowed-out shell of a man seeking a grave. Then he looked at Alara. He saw the ink on her fingers, the strength in her posture, the fierce intelligence in her eyes that she was trying so desperately to hide behind a mask of indifference. He looked past her at the solid, repaired barn, at the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, at the neat rows of the winter garden. He smelled the salt on the air and the wood smoke and the faint, good scent of the damp earth. This was real. London was the ghost. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was at a precipice. He could answer the summons, return to his gilded cage, and lose the only thing that had ever felt like home. Or he could choose this. He could choose her. Without taking his eyes off Alara's guarded face, he walked to the kitchen hearth. The fire was burning low, a bed of glowing embers. The courier took a shocked step forward. "Your Grace, what are you doing?" "That is from the king." Alistair did not answer. He looked at Alara, trying to convey with his eyes everything he could not yet say. He held the dispatch over the embers for a long, pregnant moment. He was not just destroying a letter. He was burning a bridge. He was immolating his former self. He dropped it. The wax seal melted instantly. The thick parchment blackened, curled, and then, with a soft whoosh, erupted into flame. A collective gasp came from the courier and Mrs. Gable, who had appeared in the doorway. But Alistair only watched the fire, the orange flames consuming the king's words, turning his duty to ash. When it was done, when nothing remained but a black, fluttering cinder, he turned back to the stunned courier. His voice was low and resonant, filled with an authority that came not from a title, but from a profound and settled conviction. "Ride back to London," he commanded. "Find the man who sent you. Tell him the Duke of Blackwood died a year ago in a storm. Tell him his title is empty. His seat in the Lords is vacant. There is no one here to answer the king's call." The courier stared, his mouth agape, convinced he was dealing with a madman. "Go," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Now." The man, terrified, scrambled backward, turned, and fled, leaving his satchel forgotten on the flagstones. They heard him mount his horse and gallop away, his retreat a frantic, panicked flight from this place of madness. The kitchen was silent save for the crackle of the fire. Alistair turned to face Alara. She had not moved. She stood like a statue, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide and fixed on him. The mask was gone, and in its place was a raw, terrified vulnerability. She did not understand what he had just done. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He stopped before her, so close he could see the frantic pulse beating in her throat. He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to ward off the disbelief he saw in her eyes. "My duty is not in London," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "It is not to a king or a title." He looked around the kitchen, at the heart of the world she had built. "My duty is here." He looked back at her, and finally laid his soul bare. He offered her not a flowery, romantic prose, but the bluntest, most profound truth he possessed. "This is my home, Alara. You're my home." The last of her defenses did not just crumble. They shattered into dust. The strength that had held her ramrod straight for so long, the defiance that had been her armor, simply gave way. A single tear, then another, traced a path through the faint smudge of dirt that still marked her cheek. It was not the weeping of a weak woman, but the release of a warrior who had finally been told she did not have to fight alone anymore. She did not collapse. She did not fall into his arms. Instead, she took one small, hesitant step forward and leaned her forehead against his chest. It was a gesture of immense, terrifying trust, a quiet surrender that was also a profound victory. She stood, her body trembling slightly, simply resting against him, her hands still at her sides. Alistair's own arms, which felt heavy and clumsy, came up and enclosed her. He did not crush her to him. He simply held her, his large hands resting on the strong, straight line of her back. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled not of perfume, but of wood smoke and clean, cold air. It was the scent of his home. They stood there for a long time as the light outside began to fade, a permanent fixture in the heart of the house. Outside, the autumn wind began to rise, a reminder of the coming winter. But for the first time, neither of them was afraid of the cold. They were two survivors, two builders, a duke who had renounced a kingdom for a home, and a companion who had built a home and found a partner. They were Alistair and Alara, rooted in the soil they had tilled together, a fortress of two against the world. The house around them, once a tomb, was fiercely alive and, like them, at last completely whole.